All right guys, so today it's finally time to start thinking about winterizing the beehives. It's been just a miserable fall. We've had so much rain, it's been windy, it's been wet, it's been cold. We've got a couple days here that look decent, so it's time to kind of really finish winterizing these hives. It's now already into October. We're well into October. It's October the 10th today, so the cold weather will be upon us very soon, so it's prime time to get in here and make sure that we're good to go for the winter. So I'm going to show you what I like to do, and I'm in the Pacific Northwest, so it may be different than what you do, but I'll show you what I like to do to help the bees make it through the winter. And let's go light up the smoker and get going. So there's a couple things you want to do. There's actually a number of things you want to do when you're thinking about winterizing your hives for them to have the best chance of making it through the winter and coming out strong the other side. So number one, you want to consider your varroa mite load and whether you're going to treat or not. So there's many different school of thoughts on that. I'm not going to get into detail on that right now. But it's a good idea to at least know what your mite load counts are in each of the hives and make an assessment from there whether you think you need to treat or what you're going to do about that. Number two, you want to make sure that you have enough resources for them to last the winter. Now this is going to depend really on the type of bee, so the genetics of that bee. It's going to depend on your climate, the weather. If it's whether it's really cold and they cluster for the entire winter and don't move around much, or whether it's a bit more mild and warm and they end up moving around the hive and consuming more resources. So there's a few things to consider. The general rule of thumb seems to be around 60 to 80 plus pounds of honey per hive is what you kind of want to aim for. I usually just tend to do a little bit more of a manual test. Not quite as scientific. I just do what's called the heft test, right? So I lift up the back of the hive, and if it feels heavy, I think I'm good to go. And if it feels light, well, I got to do something about it. So if you've taken all the honey off your hive by this time of the year, we're well into fall now, getting closer to winter, and you've taken all the honey off and your hive is light, you're in for a rough go, because it's almost too cold now, at least in my part of the world, to feed. You can try feeding sugar syrup, but once it goes below a certain temperature, and I think that's around 10 or 11 degrees Celsius, the bees just simply cannot take that syrup, and you have to feed them sugar instead. So that's always a possibility. You can feed them sugar, granulated sugar or sugar blocks, right? But certainly you want to make sure you leave them enough honey. That's the ideal solution. So I will make sure that they have enough honey in the hives. For each hive has, 60 plus pounds of honey. You want to make sure they have at least a little bit of pollen. So they want kind of like one frame of pollen with pollen on both sides, that amount in total. And the last thing you really want to do is make sure they have enough ventilation, that they're not totally sealed up. The biggest killer of beehives is moisture in the hive. It's not how cold it is outside. That doesn't really matter. Sometimes they do even better in really cold climates. Our moist climate like we have here in the Pacific Northwest is really tricky because there's so much moisture around, and that's one of the greatest downfalls that can happen to a hive is just moisture. So bees generate heat, the heat rises, and then it condenses on the roof of that hive and then falls down and they drown the bees. So you don't want that. You want that hot air to be able to escape, so you need some ventilation out the top or out the sides. And we also can consider adding something like a quilt board on top. Now my version of a quilt board is pretty simple. It's there's some pretty complex and neat looking quilt boards you can make and you can buy out there, but what I do is just simply put an empty box on top of the hive, fill it with newspaper, and that's it. Where the heat rises, creates condensation, which then drips down onto the newspaper, which eventually kind of soaks up that moisture, And throughout the winter or early spring, you can go in and check the newspaper. And if it's wet, you simply replace the newspaper with fresh, crumpled up newspaper. You can also use burlap, wood chips. You can Google a whole assortment of ways to really wick that moisture away. Okay, so now that we're here, we've got the smoker lit. I've just got a couple hives that I want to go ahead and take a look at in terms of adding that quilt board on top, and I also want to check the weight of them. So here we go. So I'm behind the hives here now, and this is my really scientific method of seeing if they have enough resources, right? I go behind the hive, I gave it a little heft up from the back, and just kind of feel how heavy it is. If it feels really nice and heavy, like it's kind of a little bit difficult to lift up, then I know I'm probably pretty good. Now I already went ahead and equalized all my hives and took resources from the really strong ones and moved them into the ones that were a bit light. So I know I'm pretty good for resources right now. What I will do, I will add sugar blocks into all of these hives sometime in the next month or so, just as an emergency resource in case they run out of honey for some reason, or they can't get to some of the honey in the hive. And so they'll come up and they'll be able to consume those sugar blocks throughout the winter if they need it. So it's kind of like an emergency feed. So I like to get suited up for the inspections this time of year when I'm manipulating the hives. The bees tend to be a little bit more defensive this time of year. Makes sense, it's understandable. We're coming into winter, I'm messing around in their hives. I don't fault them for that at all. But I've been zapped a couple times already, and I don't really feel like getting zinged again. The bees seem pretty docile right now, actually, which is kind of nice. So there's one other thing that we really want to do when you're winterizing, and that is verifying, and I forgot to mention this, but it's checking to make sure you have a queen. Because if you have no viable queen in your colony, it's game over. That colony is basically doomed. So if you can't get another queen, which is unlikely this time of year, then you want to go ahead and probably combine your hive with another hive. Nice frame of honey there. Queen right here. I don't know if you can see her running around in the frames. So I know this particular colony has a viable queen. You can see the green dot. So we're good to go here in terms of the queen. Then we know the hive is queen right. So we make sure they have enough resources. We put the little quilt board on top. We can tilt it forward a little bit so moisture will run out of the hive. Make sure there's proper ventilation. And eventually I'm going to also wrap these hives. Probably put some tar paper around them, and that just kind of helps keep some of the heat in as well. All right, let's get the queen back in. So here's the hive with the inner cover on. It's put back together. I verified that there's a queen, of course. We've got the inner cover here. It's got a decent amount of bees in the hive here in the top box. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an empty super on top and fill that super with newspaper. So you can see here a hole in the inner cover, and that serves a couple purposes. Typically it's used for feeding in the springtime or late summer. You put a jar feeder on top of there and the bees come up and take the syrup. But you can also put sugar blocks around around that hole, and the bees will come up and they'll consume those sugar blocks throughout the winter. So it acts as a sort of emergency feed, which is pretty handy in the months when you can't actually feed. If you think you're getting low and they're really consuming their resources, it's a good idea to have. In fact, I always put sugar blocks on all my hives, just for an extra safety precaution. It doesn't cost very much. It's easy to do and it's easy to replace. So let's fill the rest of this box up with the newspaper. There, full of newspaper. All we have to do is put the cover back on and we're good to go. Cover's back on the hive. Now one thing we also want to do is make sure that we tip the hive forward a little bit. So at the bottom, prop it up at the back so it does tip forward, leans forward a little bit. You want it leaning forward, especially through the winter. We'll make sure that we have our entrance reducer on as well. You can see this one is set here with the smallest hole, the smallest entrance. Some people do put on mouse guards as well. I've never had a problem with mice, so I don't bother. But that is certainly an option as well. Okay, so that's it for winterizing 2019, done. Well, actually, it's not totally done. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to probably try and wrap these hives up with tar paper. So I didn't do that last year. It was okay. I lost 2 hives. But I think I will try to wrap them this year with tar paper or a bee cozy or something similar, just to see if I can help them out a little bit more. Now it's not urgent right now. We've done the biggest part of the job. We've got the quilt boards on. We've got the resources are in there, the pollen, the honey. We've got the hives tipped forward a little bit. We've got the entrance reducers on. We've checked that they're queen right, and so we should be good to go. So if you like this video, please hit the like button below, subscribe to my channel, and we'll be sure to keep you posted on further updates. Thanks. Have a great winter.